Hi, I'm Amy Aldenderfer. I'm the Horticulture Agent in Hardin County, Kentucky, which is Elizabethtown. Welcome to my Attracting Pollinators class. I've done this one before, and I usually give a lot of stuff away. So we might have some, since we have your emails, we might be sending you some door prizes for attending today. So we'll see how that goes. But really for pollinating, pollinators are really important. So, oops. Okay, there we go. And why are they important? Well, they pollinate. They're pretty much important because as much as sunlight, soil, and water to the reproductive success of over 75 of the world's flowering plants. That's a lot of plants. They're really crucial for us to produce fruits, nuts, and berries. And as you can see, we've got almonds. This is chocolate. And blueberries, which are some of my favorite fruits and vegetables to eat. We usually don't list vegetables in there because vegetables are usually a plant part and not from a flower. That's why tomatoes are fruits. But there's over 150 food crops that are pollinated, including apples, oranges, squashes, tomatoes, almonds, those kinds of things. At the end of the presentation, there is a whole list of websites that will have lots and lots of resources on there for you all to look up to supplement. And some of those were actually some of the resources for this talk. So we're going to go back to 8th grade botany or 8th grade biology, and we're going to talk about pollination. So pollination is pretty much the transfer of pollen from from the anthers of the flower all the way over to the pistil of another flower. And the reason that you want different flowers from different plants is for cross-pollination. You get a better mix of genetic material, and you get a better fruit or a better plant the next time the seed comes up to germinate. And usually we have a lot of bees that are pollinators. So, you know, most of our flowers rely on pollinators, but some of them rely on wind or water. The wind ones are usually the ones that we're most allergic to. Ragweed has a green flower, not really attracted to a lot of insects or pollinators, and that's why it's wind pollinated. Certain fruits and seeds will not be produced if their flowers are not pollinated by a different plant. And then there's 100,000 different animal species that pollinate plants. Although insects are really the most common pollinators, but there's about 1,500 species of vertebrates that also pollinate plants. So we're not talking just about the insects, we're talking about vertebrates. Humans can pollinate plants very easily, but there's a lot of different things, and we'll kind of go through the pollinators. We're going to meet the pollinators. So the attributes of a good pollinator is should be highly mobile and can travel from flower to flower. It makes the cross-pollination happen. It's a really good thing for the plants. And they have a greater genetic diversity and are more capable of withstanding environmental change. So that's, you know, a good pollinator has to be able to move. Usually they have scales, hairs, or feathers where the pollen grains can get caught and stuck on them and then easily brush off into another, into the sticky part of the stigma, where they can go ahead and pollinate as that insect or creature is collecting the nectar, because that's the reward for pollinating, is the nectar. Sometimes those creatures, I'm going to have to call them creatures, have a specialized mouth parts for collecting that nectar from the plants that it visits. And sometimes they're very, very specialized for the plants that they pollinate. Charles Darwin found a orchid in Madagascar that had a 12-inch style that had the nectar at the very bottom of this spur that it had on the bottom of it. So he hypothesized that there was a moth or some type of insect that had a 12-inch tongue that could get down to that nectar and then pollinate that orchid that grew. It took them until almost the year 2000 to find that moth that actually pollinated that orchid in Madagascar, but they did find it, and then they said, he was right, there should have been an insect. So As you see in this picture, these are hummingbirds. This is our ruby-throated hummingbird. They are attracted to scarlet, orange, red, or white tubular-shaped flowers that have no distinct odors. So sometimes you'll see that things will be attracted by scent. But hummingbirds are pretty, they can be picky. I have seen them go to blue flowers, but they always have had that tubular shape on there. So some of the salvias, the blue salvias, they like to pollinate also. So hummingbirds are one of our pollinators. Bats are a pollinator. They're not a pollinator east of the Rocky Mountains. Our bats are mostly insect eaters and they eat lots of insects, but there are bats that are in the deserts of the Southwest that will pollinate flowers. They are attracted to dull white, green, or purple flowers that emit a strong musty odors at night, because when do bats fly? At night. This is the small-footed bat. And they can be very tiny, but again, they're mammals, but sometimes they pollinate flowers. We also have the bumblebee. The bumblebee can kind of get confused with my next insect, so I'll kind of talk about them a little separately. They're the most commonly found bee in Kentucky. They don't live in social colonies. They usually nest in the ground in burrows that they dig out, or they might use abandoned mammal burrows. The bumblebees are native to Kentucky, but the honeybees were brought over on the Mayflower when the European settlers came in. So that's the difference between the honeybees and the bumblebees. The bumblebees, you can tell, and I'll show this, they have a hairy abdomen down here on the bottom. If they're furry, they're a bumblebee. If they're smooth, they're a carpenter bee. We'll talk about that one next. But you can see all these little hairs are great for collecting pollen. That bee will definitely get pollen all over its body. And usually the bees have pollen sacs that they kind of scrape it all off onto their their third set of legs. And you'll see sometimes they'll have this little orange pouch on their back legs. And they'll take those back to the nest to feed their larvae. All bees that are out there, well, most bees that are out there are females, and the females, the ovipositor is their sting. So don't be messing with the honeybees. This is a carpenter bee, and as you can see, he's got a pretty, or she has got a pretty shiny backside. There's no hairs or fur on the back of this. It's not really fur, but they do look very similar to the bumblebees. Again, they'll have their pollen sacs on the back of their legs. Carpenter bees tend to chew holes into wood. Not really what we want them to do on our decks or on our wood furniture, but they do tend to have, usually it's dead wood, but you can protect that wood by painting it. They can't really eat through the latex paint very well. Sometimes they're considered pests for that reason, but they rarely do serious damage. So if you can just kind of, push them out of the way, they're okay. Carpenter bees are pretty docile bees. They tend not to sting very easily. So even the ones that are hovering in your face, if you just kind of, I hate to say swat them away, but just kind of ignore them, they will go away and they won't sting you as readily unless you like squash them or step on them. But again, they do pollination. So we're kind of grouping them in with the pollinators. These are Halictid bees. Sometimes they're called orchard bees or hover bees, sweat bees. There's lots of little names for these, but these are pretty metallic green. They have these beautiful colors. They do have the black and yellow because they are able to sting. They don't tend to sting people very well. They do like to land on you if you're sweaty and lick the salt off of you. That kind of gives them a little edge over their neighbors. Let's see. And they usually only sting you if you swat them or squish them. So don't do that. They're solitary and they create underground nests for their offspring. They're also very interesting to biologists because many of the Halictid bees have evolved to live in social colonies very recently in evolutionary history, where our honeybees have always kind of way back millions of years ago have become social insects. the Halictid bees have really done that fairly lately. They although they may nest in localized areas, there is some, you know, they show an intermediate social behavior where they kind of create nests next to each other, but they don't really work together. Whereas honeybees tend to work together for the good of the nest. The Halictid bees are still pretty solitary, but they're kind of like neighbors. They may borrow a cup of sugar every once in a while to see how that goes. So you'll see them on some of the open flowers, but really you'll see some of them making mud nests. So for these kind of bees and some of the ground nesting bees, you might need some open soil in your gardens or in your backyard for bees to nest in. That is perfectly okay in my book. So here's a Halictid bee. You might see some mason bees. They're what we call a blue orchard bee. The orchard bees or the mason bees are really kind of interesting because she uses a hollow out reed to collect nectar and pollen. And later in the presentation, I'll show you one of their nests that have been cut away. So you can see how they build that. And they're called mason bees because of the way they build their nests. Because she puts nectar and pollen in a little spot, she'll lay an egg, and then she'll wall it off with some mud. A good reason now to have mud in your yard. And then she'll fill the next little cell, wall it off, and fill the next one and lay an egg and wall it off. The cool thing about mason bees is that they'll start at the very back end of the tube and they'll fill it to the front. And then for some reason that I don't know, the front egg that was the last one laid is going to be the first one out, and that will be a male bee, so that he'll be ready to pollinate or fertilize the bees that come back out later in the season, because you've got to have that first bee out, then the next one, and the next one going back. So the first one laid is the last one out, which I think is interesting on how they figure out how to do this. Let's see, did I read all that? Yes, I did. So that's one of the things that mason bees do. It was just kind of cool. Here's a mason bee emerging. I'm not sure if that's a male or a female, but they're pretty cute coming out of the little nest. You may see mason bee houses, which are pretty interesting to have in your backyard to see. And I'll show you some pictures of those later on. Let's see. They don't sting, they don't have anything to protect because they don't have a big honey store or a brood. They don't fly into large hairy mammals to resolve territorial issues. Masons tend to use existing holes, so they don't dig into your furniture. So, you know, they're much cuter and smaller than honeybee houses. So we're going to try to give those a little try for that. Whew. This is a wool carder bee. Has anybody seen any of these? If you're out there looking, they're a little small, but they have a huge group of huge family members. They are known as the wool carding bees because their back legs scrape fibers from a plant to line their nests, which is usually either a hollow reed or some type of nesting block. They will also go into the mason bee houses that you'll see. So she can line her nest with those fibers. The male carder bees are often seen guarding a patch of flowers, and he can be quite aggressive, fending off any interlopers, but just to other insects, not necessarily to humans. He will take on even larger bees than himself, like bumblebees and honeybees. These wool carder bees are probably about 1/4 of an inch long. They're not very big. And those wool carders are allowed to go into the guarded area in return for a chance to mate. So it's kind of fun to watch those. They're small, about 1/2 to 3/4 inch long, and they're black to brown or white. And then she carries her pollen on the underside of her abdomen instead of on her legs. So those are the wool carder bees. And our non-native honeybee. They're most commonly seen in Kentucky. They're the only bee that lives in a social colony. They can build their hives in hollow trees, man-made structures, sometimes houses as opposed to a beehive. And they were brought to the United States for their honey and their wax production. production. And we can see those often foraging around in a lot of our plants that are in the garden. Although I've seen a lot fewer in my garden this year than I have in the past. So those are the bees. And we didn't talk about the flies. Flies are great pollinators. This is a hoverfly, and you can tell it's a fly because look at those big giant eyes. It looks like a bee. If I flip back to the honeybee, you can see it's got brown and yellow stripes. It's got big eyes, but it also has long antennae, and it's got 4 pairs of wings. If you look at the hoverfly, it only has 2 wings or 1 pair of wings, and it's got little tiny kind of squatty antennae. This is what I call a sweat bee, because if they land on you, the little tail goes up and down, and you think it's going to sting you, but it can't. It doesn't have a stinger. It's a fly. So flies are usually attracted to the green, white, and cream flowers with little odor, or dark brown and purple flowers that have putrid odors, like rotting flesh. Not so much the hoverflies, but we're talking about garden flies. They're important pollinators and can be found feeding on flower blossoms or around aphid colonies where they lay their eggs. The larvae of the hoverflies are important predators of pests such as aphids, scales, thrips, and caterpillars. And I will flip to the next one, because if you look at the larvae, this is a much better predator, just like the ladybug larvae, at eating aphids. They're awesome as aphid control, and they've actually found that you can control a lot of your aphids that way, and they're becoming more available commercially. It looks like it's the head is kind of pointy, look kind of right there. Larvae should be retracted from insecticidal sprays, and you can even harm them by using insecticidal soap. So if you've got a huge aphid colony somewhere and you see a lot of these little sweat bees around, you probably have larvae that are going to take care of that, which is a good biological way to take care of your aphids instead of spraying. The larvae crawl around like little slugs, and they actually eat. They have little jaws. Oops, I'm pointing to my screen and not that. They have little jaws that will actually eat the larvae of the aphids, and then it will drain its bodily fluid contents, which is kind of gross. And then it pupates into an adult. I won't read through all of this because it's. And the adults are kind of small to medium size with a body length of up to 5/8 of an inch, as I showed before. So they can be kind of large. Let's see. And they mimic, they're trying to keep their, from being eaten by looking like a bee, because nobody wants to eat a bee. So not only do we have flies that pollinate, we have moths that pollinate. This is a hummingbird moth, and this is a day-flying moth. They're really kind of cool because they hover just like a hummingbird does, and they have these clear wings, so they kind of look like a little bird, and they're loud. You can hear them hover pretty good. They're attracted to red, pink, purple flowers that emit a strong, sweet odor. They're a member of the sphinx moth family, and then what you'll see in these hummingbirds is that the males will have, I should say hummingbird moths, the males have this little flare of hairs at the bottom that look like a tail. So they actually use those in flight to kind of keep them going. But because they're a sphinx moth, they look like a tomato hornworm. The trick is they don't have any of those little stripes on the sides like the tomato hornworms do. And they don't really eat tomatoes, but they're a pretty big caterpillar when you see them. And they always have that little spiked tail called a hornworm. So if you see those, make sure that you leave it alone, because it'll be a hummingbird moth and not a hornworm for your tomatoes. So we have moths and we have butterflies. Butterflies are great pollinators. If you go to the butterflies and moths of North America, they have a database that includes verified sightings for each county. So if you want to know how many, if you're on a butterfly hunt and you like to look at butterflies, Hardin County has almost over 1,000 butterfly species and moth species that have been recorded and cited in Hardin County. But you can go to your own county and find out how many are in your county, and then try to look and find them all. So this is a morning cloak. This is one of the early spring butterflies. This is one of the blues. I'm not really sure which one this one is. But as you can see, the butterflies have straight antennae with a little club on the end. And if we go back to our moths, they usually have some feathered-like antennae. Let's see if I can go back. Yeah, this one has a little thicker antennae, so he's technically a moth. I'm taking an entomology course, so I have to know all the little details. But here are some of the most common butterflies you'll see. You'll see cloudless sulfurs. They're the early yellow butterflies. And if you have these larval host plants, you're more likely to see the adults. But the adults will pretty much go to anything. Some are very picky, some are not. So the cloudless sulfurs, like the peas, the morning glories, the cardinal flowers as adults, and they'll eat the sennas and the partridge peas. And the cloudless sulfurs are pretty big. They're about 1 inch to 1.5 inches on the wing. Here's the eastern tailed blue. They're the little tiny butterflies that you'll see in your turf grass if you've got clover. I see them all the time when I mow. So they love clover. The larvae do, wild peas, tickfoil. The adults, you'll see flower nectar and mud. Some adults don't feed very well, and they need those minerals out of the mud to become, to be a better breeder. Let's just put it that way. Here's our state butterfly, the Viceroy, and you can tell it's the Viceroy by this little orange line, or sorry, the dark line through the orange. They like willows, poplars, and cottonwoods. And then this one, the adults will also find carrion, dung, and fungi, and flower nectar tasty. Not my cup of tea for lunch, but that's okay. The larvae of the Viceroy looks like bird poop, which is a practical protectant for that. Let's see. Here's the question mark. Can y'all find the question mark? It's right here. Look. There's one called a comma, which also has a little comma on the underside of its leaves. But when it closes its wings, it looks like a piece of leaf. And when it opens it up, it looks pretty and orange. Rotting fruit is also an attractant for some butterflies. Painted ladies, sometimes they're not picky feeders. Their larvae will eat just about anything. But the adults will feed from 3 to 6 feet high. So you kind of need some tall flowers in your garden if you're going to attract the painted lady. So we've got butterflies, we've got bees. Have you thought about beetles? There's lots of beetles out there that are attracted to flowers. And some of them are mostly white or green, but they're not picky. And sometimes they'll be more attracted to strongly fruity or foul smelling flowers for that. So here's our pollinators. What can you do to attract pollinators? Well, that's the question. The best thing to do is plant a garden. If you plant native flowers, the native pollinators will come. But you want to choose a variety of colors and shapes that will attract a variety of pollinators. Of course, that's the goal of a lot of gardeners too, is to have lots of colors and shapes. Choose plants that bloom at different times, so you have a whole range of pollen and nectar throughout the season. You can have stuff flowering in your garden from February till November. So if you're, there's your range right there. December, January, kind of iffy to get some flowers out there. Really depends on the season. Some of the crocus will come up very early. The other thing is to plant your flowers in clumps. I never buy just one plant of a species. So if I'm going to buy yarrow, like this pink yarrow here in the picture, I'm going to buy 3 plants, and I'm going to kind of spread them out in a little triangle, because bees and insects don't have eyes like we do, and they really need to see clumps of color. So like they have done here, their tick seed coreopsis is all in a group. They've got their yarrow all together. I'm not sure what this little purple stuff is, but that's a big clump. There's a big clump of yarrow back here that's yellow, and their columbine are all kind of clumped together. so that the bees can see it. And then eventually this clump over here will, you know, bloom and flower. This bush over here will bloom and flower, and those bees and insects can see them. This is an awesome resource. It's Selecting Plant for Pollinators. It's in the resource guide at the end. For most of Kentucky, the Eastern Broadleaf Forest is the one that you really want to use. But they have one that's for a little bit farther western Kentucky, kind of that, you know, farthest west quarter of the state. And they have lists and lists and lists of things that are native that will attract those native pollinators. Here's some less nesting and egg-laying habitat. So here's just a hole in the ground that a ground nesting bee has dug. Here are those mason bee boxes. And because mason bees don't care, you can paint them a funky color if you want to, or just leave them naturally brown. These are bamboo and paper tubes that you can put in there. This is a hoverfly laying eggs on just a reed stem, a stem of a plant that's been left in the garden. I think sometimes we get a little crazy gardeners of cleaning up the garden, and we lose some of that natural habitat that those insects like to grow in or to lay their eggs. And if we always put it in the compost pile, well, I think it rots a little bit too fast for them to lay their eggs on. So don't be too fast about taking down dried stems and things of that sort in the garden. And down here in the lower right is the mason bee, how they lay their eggs. So she's put pollen in here and laid her eggs, and there's the wall. And she's done that all the way, and she'll fill up that little tube and cap it off and then start on another one. So that's our nesting materials for that. You can also just leave some dead wood up. Now they've kind of gusseted these up with some glass bottles and tubes. I think that's an Erlenmeyer flask, or I don't know what kind of flask that is. But yeah, there's all sorts of ways you can leave the dead wood in the garden and make it pretty. So that's nesting and egg-laying habitat for you. And then plant diversely. You want to provide a diverse habitat with plant sizes and heights and types. So some bees like to land flat onto a flower. So the chrysanthemums or the dill is a more of a flat or an umbrella shaped plant. There's lots of daisy type plants that are out there, but then there's some that are pea shaped. So you need all of those different kinds of flowers out there for plants, for bees, sorry, for the pollinators. They also need water. Now this spring we've probably been okay with water, but I have one of these out in my garden. It's not this fancy. It's basically the saucer with some rocks in it. Looks more like this. If you just want to catch a little bit of water from your downspout, that's okay. These are cloudless sulfurs that are puddling. These are mostly males that are trying to kind of beef themselves up by sucking the minerals out of the sand. You can make one of these with a little pile of sand and some a little bit of salt and a little bit of like sugar water, and you'll get some butterflies to come to that. This is a bee watering kit where you just have the water that's about halfway up the sides of those marbles, and then they can land but not drown. That's the trick. You want them to land but not drown. And then you can do the same thing with plant material. This is the cup plant, and it has, where the leaves attach to the stem, there's a well that will put water right in there. So if you have that plant in your garden, it's one of our native prairie plants, and you spray it with the hose every once in a while, you'll get water to collect in there, but not enough for like mosquitoes to collect. If you have the downspout or the little bee water, you need to kind of rinse those out every couple of days to make sure you don't get any mosquito larvae in there, because putting BT in there would not be a good idea either for the insects. And the reason I really wanted to do this class this week was it's Pollinator Week. Happy Pollinator Week 2020 through the COVID-19 epidemic. But we've had a lot more time to observe the pollinators this week. And so I want you to go out and celebrate. all those pollinators that are out there, and we've gone through probably the whole list today. And so we have some resources. This is the native pollinators that I was telling you about, that booklet. That booklet is fairly large. The Circe Society, which is a really good group to look for. USDA Forest Service has some good, lovely publications out there. Fish and Wildlife. And if you are just that geeky, Bees of the East is a really interesting discussion on all the bees out there. It goes through all of them. If you want to have an idea, a lot of them. Attracting Pollinators, there's a really good book. Plants for Pollinators. West Virginia, if you're in the eastern part of the state, they have a really good reference. Let's see, Circe Society. Oh, and then plant lists. If you need a plant list, oh, there's a billion of them out there. New England Wildflower Society, the Monarch Watch has some. Although I will caution you, if you want monarch butterflies in your garden, incorporate that into a garden. Don't just plant the milkweeds out there, because they have found, UK's found that if you just plant milkweeds, the caterpillars get picked off by wasps. So you need to mix those in with some of your other plants so that you do the best for everybody and not just feed the wasps the caterpillars. Plantings for Pollinators. This one's really good from NRCS. There's a whole publication on native milkweeds, and butterfly nectar sources. That's a really good one. So I have come to the end of my talk. Oh, I did pretty good. I'm usually an hour into it. So if you all have any questions, I will take questions.